Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. We are looking at various battles around the world this week, but we're starting today in the Eastern Front, hence the video there. My guest, Craig Luther, is a retired US Air Force historian and author of several Eastern Front books. He joins us today to talk about his various trips to the Rzhev area on the Trail of Army Group Center. We will be talking forests, cities, rivers, mosquitoes, possibly, and terrain generally. And links to at least two of his books are in the description below, but I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon or good morning where you are, Craig. How are you today?
Well, I'm doing fine. Got all my my home chores done with all our cats and pigs and horses. So and did a little boning up on all this material for our discussion. So I think I'm ready to go.
Good. So we were just talking before going live. There are battlefields around the world that are easier to visit than others. I mean, I live in Normandy, which gets 2 million visitors a year. There's other ones, perhaps Arnhem is quite easy to get to, and there are others that are much harder. And right now, with the climate of the war in Ukraine, Russia is sort of not completely off limits, but it's mostly off limits. So tell us about your trips, because they were a few years ago now. Why were you going? When were you going? And what was the background?
Well, most of all the work that I've done, the historical work in this century, has been on the Eastern Front. And I think with my new book that's coming out in actually now, it'll be my sixth publication dealing specifically with the Eastern Front. Yeah, you have several of my earlier books up there. Actually, on my first visit was in 2005, was in May and June of 2005. And I went with a group of German veterans from the 6th Infantry-Division. Going back to the times of Frederick the Great, most German units were recruited territorially out of a certain region. And the 6th Infantry Division came from like Western Central Germany, Gütersloh, Detmold, in that area and through there. So the group is called the Kuratorium Rzhev. And since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain, they have been making an annual trip to Russia, all in the spirit of Versöhnung, reconciliation with the Russian people. So I went with a group, a fairly large group of veterans in 2005. We visited some of the battlefields around Rzhev. We met with Russian veterans. One thing that was quite funny, Paul, the German veterans, obviously they're very sensitive about this. And they're very, very much concerned with the whole that mission of reconciliation is really important to them. So we were visiting old folks' homes and schools, and the Kuratorium is donating money. But all of the veterans, they're all dressed in suits, very nicely, but you won't see a single medal on a German soldier who was among us. But when we met with a group of Russian veterans, they looked like, I don't know, 21st century rappers. They had so much bling on their chest. It was just, I mean, the asymmetry, what was just, I mean, you noticed it immediately. And of course, nobody said anything, but that they were, of course, very old men then. You wondered how they even stood up under the weight of all those medals they had on their chest. But it was an amazing experience. Unfortunately, just before we came back, we can talk about this in more detail later. I got the proverbial shit beaten out of me. Was nearly beaten to death. Just the evening before we were to fly back to Frankfurt. I was very lucky to live. Managed to crawl into the hotel, and they took me to in an ambulance to a hospital in Rzhev. Of course, I remember none of this. I mean, afterward, my shirt, I mean, it was soaked in blood. I still have some scars on the side of my face. And this just gives you an idea of the poverty in that part of the world. We were in a city about 200 kilometers from Moscow, west of Moscow. So we're still in the orbit of the capital city. But in the hospital, they didn't have proper gauze to mend my wounds. And I was cut all up on the face. They had kicked me so many times, and I was knocked out immediately when they hit me. They kicked me so many times on my right side. My right side was tar black, and they didn't have any gauze. So the German Russian translator who was with me, spent the whole time there with me, she literally had to take handkerchiefs out of her purse to give them to the doctors to dress my wounds. And apparently I wasn't coming around, and they were within a few minutes of calling the US Embassy and maybe helicoptering me over to, I guess, a US military hospital. But finally I did come around, and other than a really bad headache for a week or so, I was okay. So that was my first experience in Russia. The second time was 2016, in June of 2016. And that was an amazing trip. I was with Johannes Haape, who is the son of Dr. Heinrich Haape, who wrote the really the iconic Eastern Front memoir, Moscow Tram Stop. He was a battalion doctor and Assistenzarzt, a second lieutenant doctor in the 3rd Battalion of the 18th Infantry Regiment, which was attached to the 6th Infantrie-Division. And his memoir, he survived the war, emigrated to South Africa in 52. In 57, he published his memoir called Moscow Tram Stop, a doctor's experiences with the German spearhead in Russia. He published that in 1957 with Collins, but it hadn't been published again in English since the late 50s. So I got together with his son, Johannes. I proposed, why don't we do a new publication? And we did, and we got that published in 2020. And I have it right here. Here is a copy of the book. It's a tremendous memoir if you are interested in the Eastern Front, and a very unique perspective, the perspective of a doctor, but a doctor who wasn't only involved in trying to save the lives of his soldiers, but because even in the summer and fall of 1941, the front was often so porous that he found himself in combat quite often against Russian soldiers who were either trying to escape to the east or had infiltrated their lines. And by the summer of 1942, Dr. Heinrich Haape had become one of the most highly decorated doctors on the Eastern Front. He had the Iron Cross, 1st and 2nd class. He had the German Cross in gold. He had been submitted for a Ritterkreuz, for a Knight's Cross. That was turned down for some reason, but he did get the German Cross in gold, which is a very high honor. And he was awarded a special medal by his corps commander in the summer of 1942 for single-handedly destroying a Soviet T-34 tank. Fascinating guy, a brilliant man. He had, not only was he a great doctor, he had a PhD, I believe, in philosophy, some other degrees. And he was also, he was very much what you would call, I guess, a very conservative German man. He believed in the war in the East because his father had been a pastor. He was a very Christian man, very decent man, and he feared the Soviet Union and what would happen to the Abendland, to Western Europe, if the Soviets were to ever invade and take it over. So he actually supported Hitler's Operation Barbarossa. At the same time, he was not, and I know this may sound like a cliche because people say this all the time, but it's true. And you can read I have a very extensive introduction in the book. He was not a brown shirt. He was not a Nazi. At one time, after he'd gotten out of he finally left the Eastern Front in May of 1943 and became the chief doctor in Strasbourg. If he'd stayed on the Eastern Front, we never would have heard of him again because he would have been destroyed. He would have been probably just disappeared when the Russians launched Operation Bagration on the 22nd of June, 1944. And like 28 out of Army Group Center's 36 divisions just disintegrated. Hundreds of thousands were killed, wounded, taken prisoner. And the chances of him having survived that debacle are very small. And they're also very small because of the way his character and the way he fought. He did not have his dressing stations. He had them as close to the front as possible. And in a lot of these battles that we might go through, he would actually, he would be right at the tip of the spear. He would follow with the lead soldiers into combat and then begin taking care of the wounded. So he was not a man who tried to shirk any of the danger. He was right up front in the middle of things throughout his period on the Eastern Front.
And it's my experience that doctors are very good at writing memoirs because they have that attention to detail. I mean, I can't even think of how many books I've got written by regimental doctors. I'm thinking of and chaplains, anybody involved in that kind of aspect, because they seem to have that, just ability to remember details. It's the way their brains function. And they're always, as you said, they're always in the thick of things. We had a question from Nick. Did he ever get to meet Field Marshal von Bock?
No, I don't. No, not that I know of. Of course, von Bock was the commander of Army Group Center until I believe the December, when everything was starting to go south for the Germans. I won't get into that now, but he had a history of stomach problems, serious stomach problems. In fact, he'd been in the hospital in November of 1940, or sometime at the end of the year, and Hitler had actually come to visit von Bock, and that's when Hitler, I think, told Bock for the first time that he's planning, this Barbarossa attack on Russia. But by that time, I mean, these were older men. He was 60, 61 at the time. And the strain that he must have been under fighting this war day in and day out. And then you're in the middle of the winter. You have temperatures that are falling to minus 30, 40, and even more below centigrade. And like with so many of the other generals, Strauss with 9th Army, Guderian with the 2nd Panzer Group, he just wore out. And on the 19th, he was replaced by Field Marshal von Kluge, who hitherto had commanded the 4th Army. But no, Haape, no, he never had an opportunity to meet Bock or to meet with Hitler, or any of those higher ups that I am aware of.
Okay. So we've got the map there on screen, and there are several maps there, because your trips, you were obviously covering the Barbarossa movements going east, but also the Barbarossa, once it's all over, coming back west again. And then, as you said, if you'd stayed there, you could have moved to the other areas where Bagration took place. So, as a historian studying the battlefields, were you able to process that you're standing perhaps in some places that are fought for twice, or even, as you said there, the fluid nature of the battle, maybe even more than twice? Do you have the kind of brain that can kind of process in one go, okay, so this is the first time this is fought over, and then a few weeks later or months later they fought over this place again? How do you kind of process it when you're doing your research?
Well, the reason we took this trip, as I mentioned, was to verify. We traveled, me and Dr. Haape's son, Johannes Haape, with our wonderful Russian guide, Sergei. He had been a colonel or lieutenant colonel in the Russian military, and he lived, at this time, he had emigrated to Belarus, and he lived with his wife in Minsk, a wonderful guy. And with him at the helm, we traveled about 4,500 kilometers from Berlin all the way to Moscow, and to the farthest reaches that had been the farthest point of the advance of the 6th Infantry Division in the fall of 1941, where they had passed Rzhev and they had reached a point farther north, just to the west of the town of Kalinin, on the, I don't know how you even pronounce it, a little river, the Tama, TMA is what the river was called. And then, of course, in mid-December, they started, after the Soviets had counterattacked, they started to pull back. But you go through this driving through the center of Belarus, and then into, passing Vitebsk, then getting into Russia, to Smolensk and so forth. You notice a number of things. First of all, you notice how incredibly bad the roads still are. The main thoroughfare that took us through Belarus, I think from Minsk, all the way to Smolensk. I have a bunch of general staff, original general staff maps sitting here, but I don't think I'll pull them out and try and look at them now. I think it'd take a little too much time, but the road was undivided, and it went through just a massive forest. And a lot of these forests, unlike the forests in Western Europe, and I don't think it's changed much. The forests in Germany, Western Europe, they were all well manicured, well attended to, very well taken care of. What you saw in Belarus and Russia were what the German word would be Urwälder, just like almost primeval in their nature, because they were never cleared out, incredibly dense. And if you were a German infantryman marching along that road, and that's what the 6th Infantry, what Haape's infantry division was doing after the first couple of days. But the first couple of days were very fascinating, and we need to discuss them. But after that, and the Russians had started to pull back, they just were marching 20, 30, 40 kilometers a day, seeing virtually no combat until the middle of July, when they finally broke through their sector of the Stalin line. But, a lot of the Red Army forces during the initial attack, the Germans had established such powerful force ratios in their favor in the sectors where they were attacking, what they would call the Schwerpunkte, the key focal points of their attack, that a lot of the Russians, they just fled. They fled into the forests. Some of them were eventually joined their original units. Others surrendered, and some of them just got out of their uniforms, got into civilian clothes, and began to fight with the partisans. But if you're German infantry and you're marching along one of these roads, you're dealing constantly with these Russian stranglers coming out of these forests and attacking you. And the strain that must have put on the men who are experiencing this, plus the Germans had maps, right? Like you would expect, they had maps. But a lot of the maps they had went back to World War I. And some of the roads were written with red lines. A red line on the map supposedly signified a good road. When the Germans got in there, and sorry about that.
You've had a cat coming in. People love it when the pets come in, get involved.
Yes, I have a cat ringtone. Both my wife and I, we try to put them on at the same time to confuse our cats. It's kind of funny. But these roads, you're an officer and it says, oh, this looks like a good road because it's a red line. They turned out to be nothing but, for the most part, but dirt roads, sand roads. They weren't, what a European would call metalled, a metalled road. There were only a couple roads like that led directly to Moscow. And they were supposed to be reserved for the mechanized units, okay? In Army Group Center, in the sector of Guderian's Panzer Group, which was on the right flank, they had their Panzerstrasse 1 and Panzerstrasse 2, which were fairly decent roads. But the infantry, for the most part, was supposed to march on these sandy roads, through these forests, and it was incredibly hot. The horses that they had, the larger Western European breed of horses, would get their hooves stuck up to their ankles at trying to pull the artillery pieces. Many of them died in the process. It wasn't uncommon for men to get heat stroke, and it was not like a Western European country. And all of this, this difficult terrain created what Karl von Clausewitz, a great German military philosopher from the 19th century, would have called friction. Anything in your environment that militates against the smooth unfolding of your plan. And all the assumptions, because the roads were so bad, we talk about the railroads too, they weren't much better. All the assumptions the German logisticians and field commanders had made about, how far one unit of fuel would take them. A unit of fuel was supposed to take them 100 kilometers. Well, it would do that in Western Europe. It wouldn't do that in Russia. They were actually using up oil, Paul, in their filters at a rate, on occasion, 100 times faster than they had initially anticipated. You had divisions like the 7th Panzer Division, 2/3 of its tanks were knocked out, 2 or 3 weeks into the war, not because of combat, but because it all broken down because of the horrific infrastructure in, as they crossed the frontier and went into European Russia. So the roads were terrible. The heat was really bad. The Germans were not allowed until, in many units, until like the 4th of July, like 2 weeks into the war, to unbutton the couple top buttons of their blouse. to give them just a little relief from the heat, if you can imagine that. And then, of course, in some of these positions, there are horrible issues, horrible problems with mosquitoes and other insects. And then when you get into the fall, you had just this horrific problem with lice. And I don't want to get too far out on ahead of my skis here, but those are some of the issues. Now, there were some advantages, I suppose, too. European Russia, it's totally flat. You look at the combat, if you've seen videos where the combat is going on now in Ukraine, you know, you will have rises, small hills that might go up a few hundred meters, but most of the terrain is just totally flat, and the rivers run largely from, you know, the Bug, the Berezina, the Dnieper, the Volga. They run primarily north-south.
Yeah.
So they cut right across the German route of advance. But one thing that gave the Germans an advantage, ironically enough, both when they were attacking and retreating, is that the left bank is almost always higher than the right bank. So when they reach the Dnieper and they're on the left bank, they can see down into the Russian positions on the eastern bank, or I guess if another way to look at it, that would be heading down toward the Black Sea. That would be the left bank, and then the Germans would be on the right bank. But so they had that advantage of having an area on the left banks, or excuse me, on the western side of the river that was higher than the bank on the other side.
See, we could stop the live stream right now, Craig. Yeah. That factoid alone is the kind of thing we brought you here for. That just that detail about the banks on the west being higher. Already in the viewing, you know, the sidebar, Willie has said, I didn't realize that about the river. So we've already learned something we can take away from this. Even if nothing else happens in the show, we've already got that factoid there.
It probably won't. Well, nothing else will probably happen, but at least we got this.
At least we got that one. We can bank that one there. So we've got these photos. All of these photos are also available on Craig's fantastic website, and the link to that about the Barbarossa website is in the description below. So we're just going to basically move through the photos, and Craig's going to tell us anecdotes about the trip. So, you know,
do you have photos, earlier, Paul? Do you have photos here of the bunkers?
We'll get them in a minute. I mean, you mentioned that Rzhev itself is a little bit, or at least when you were there 20 years ago, is a little bit kind of run down and industrial. It's not the best part of Russia. It's fair to say, isn't it? No.
It was a town of about 60,000, very run down. The roads, the main thoroughfares, full of pockmarks, and it was kind of stunning to me. A town that was literally this is a perfect example of the Soviet era blockhouses that they lived in, their apartments. I mean, in a poor sector like in Compton, California, you'd live in something much better than this. But the people we met seemed to be happy and seemed to enjoy their lives. But you can see that this is really just something so different than most of the United States or Western Europe, and they had like supermarkets and places where you could buy the latest CD from Madonna, but you wouldn't walk into a really nice department store, go up an elevator and stuff to get there. No. They would be sitting in wooden boxes, rows of wooden boxes lined up, and you would just look through and pick something out that you'd wanted and pay for it. It was all just very elementary. I don't know how
Mm.
else you'd describe it.
And yet, when they do their monuments tend to be pretty grand, pretty
Yes.
spacious, pretty. You know, and I mean, I haven't been to Russia, but when I was in, Budapest and Hungary and Slovakia a couple of years ago, although they're obviously kind of downplaying the Red Army monuments now, but when they were in their prime back in the Soviet Warsaw Pact days, they always were big and spacious and parks and more T-34s on bloody great concrete plinths than you can throw
Oh
a
my
stick
Lord.
at. I mean,
I saw a zillion of them, and leave that picture up there, Paul. I want to speak to it too. When we were coming to Smolensk, and that great cathedral is sitting up on the hill above us. I know there's a T-34 on a stanchion, and I noticed there are clothes hanging off the gun. And we get a little closer, and it looked like there were a couple of bras that were hanging off the gun. And so I asked Sergei, I asked our guide, what the hell is that about? He said, oh, well, the young people love these places where we have these T-34s and monuments. They love to have their weddings there. And they will leave stuff behind. I mean, it's so different. The Russian people are so, Eastern Europeans are so different than we are. Could you imagine some college kids in England, some young college girl in England or the United States? Oh, I want to find the nearest. I want to go to Gettysburg and have my wedding next to a couple of Confederate canyon on Cemetery Ridge.
I mean, I guess it's connected with that idea of it being a people's war.
Yes.
Whereas maybe we think of it in terms of, well, this is where the military did their thing, and we visit battlefields as students of the military history. There, they see it much more as part of their individual history, as well as it being their country's history. I
Yes,
suppose hence why they have their weddings there, because it's part of their DNA. It's odd for us. That's why you're here.
Yeah, it's exactly what I was going to say. It's in their bloodstream. And in fact, you go back to the communist era after the war, the 50s, 60s, 70s, they'd suffered so much, their country had been so badly destroyed that their economy in the 50s, 60s, 70s only rebounded very slowly. So seeking legitimacy, or one of the only things that gave the communist regime legitimacy, was that they had won the Great Fatherland War.
Yeah.
At the expense of maybe 27 million human beings. We know now roughly evenly divided between soldiers and civilians. But what we're looking at here, Paul, is in Rzhev. There are two cemeteries adjacent, a German cemetery and a Russian cemetery. And this, like, you can see the part of the Russian cemetery, we see the obelisk over on the right. And it took some doing on the part of the Kuratorium Rzhev to get the Russians to agree to a German military cemetery, but it was there in 2005. I think it was originally built in like 2002. And when I was there in 2016, I was there on the 22nd of June, 2016, the 75th anniversary of the invasion. And Putin had ordered every town, village, city in Russia to remember that day, to do something to remember that day. And I'll never forget, we got in that latitude, it gets light at like 3 a.m. So we were up at 3 a.m. and watching the flowers, the beautiful bouquets of flowers on boats that they had going down the Volga, and all the speakers and people out there marching. It was it was really quite an event. But the main part of it was when, and I know you can't show it on this site because of the idiocy at YouTube. We were spectators as they buried the remains of 1,200 Russian soldiers.
Yeah.
They had dug a huge pit. You can see that. You can see it all on my website. A huge pit about the size of a large swimming pool, and they were putting the coffins into that large pit and burying 120. They are constantly digging. There was so much fighting that went on in that region, Paul, for like 15 months. They're constantly digging up new bodies. When I was there in 2005, the couple German soldiers took me out to an area under a clump of birch trees. We dug a little bit, and there were bones and skulls is still sitting there. And they and the Germans vets told me these are the bones of some German Fallschirmjäger, some paratroopers from an elite paratroop unit that had provided reinforcements in our area in January of 1942. I was never able to confirm that, but kind of a tragic thing. The Russian soldiers did not have dog tags like we did. I'm sure that the Brits did.
Yep.
And the Germans did. The Germans had a dog tag, and you may have some pictures of it with
we've got that later on. Yep.
Vital information on it, and you can tear it in half if the soldier's killed. One half will stay with the soldier, the other half goes to the Red Cross, so you know who the man is. The Russians didn't do that. Oh, here are those bunk. Yeah, here are some of the German. We were at the German War Graves Commission office in Smolensk, and they have bags of these things that they have uncovered. But the Russians didn't do that. They just, they're mostly peasants and mostly illiterate or quasi-illiterate peasants, and they were superstitious. And they were supposed to put just a piece of paper inside this little plastic container with their name and basic information on it if they were killed. Well, most of them, as I said, were superstitious, and they said, no, that means I'll get killed if I do that. So when they were found, they had no information on them. So when they were buried that day, they're just burying remains. They don't know who those people are, which is a very tragic thing. But can you go back to the bunker?
Well, let's go back to we'll come to them in order, otherwise I'll get all confused. Okay. Let's go back to the terrain, because I'm really fascinated by that kind of ground cover that is in a lot of the photos you get. It kind of looks to me like kind of bracken and brambles and undergrowth. And is that everywhere there?
Yeah, pretty much. If it isn't forested, there are also, in certain regions, our Army Group Center didn't have to deal with for the most part, with a lot of swampy terrain or swamps. Now, right on the border between Army Group Center and Army Group South, there was the Pripyat marshes, a huge area which didn't see much because it was just totally swampy ground, not really traversable for armor or mechanized units. But there was something that the Germans called Kusselgelände, and it was terrain where there were just not really forests, but just lots of tall bushes and so forth, and short little trees that I guess would kind of act as a force multiplier for the defenders, just like the forests did. And there was a lot of, I guess you'd just call it, untamed terrain in Soviet Russia at
I
that
think that's,
time.
that's what you said about the forests earlier, because when we've done shows on this channel about jungle, because there's kind of
Yeah,
cultivated jungle in parts of it, there's
yeah,
pine tree jungle, there's the kind of the deep canopy jungle, and I think when we are thinking of forests, some people maybe are thinking of the Ardennes, some people are maybe thinking of the managed forests in the UK, or
no,
they're
no,
thinking of, I don't know,
yeah,
the rock. This, as you said, that it's the untamed nature, the fact that it hasn't got paths running through it. It's just, as you said, primeval, a very different type of terrain.
yeah. And as we get farther, you'll see the road I was talking about when
Yeah.
we drove through Belarus, I believe it was, and the forests on either side. Now this is so typical of the war just was such a demographic disaster for the Russians. 27 million people, according to modern demographers, were killed. And the global loss, when you think of young men and young women who never met and
Yeah.
never had children because they were killed one way or another in the war. The global loss is set at something like 56 million human beings. That this war that lasted for 1,418 days cost the Russian people. But you can drive and drive and drive through this along this pathway that Haape's division took into Russia, through Belarus, and then through the northern tip of Poland, and then into Russia proper. You can drive and drive for kilometers without seeing any sign of life,
Yeah.
because thousands of villages, just tens of thousands, just vanished.
Yeah.
But they were destroyed in the fighting, in the scorched earth implemented by the Russians when they pulled back, or the Germans when they pulled back. And what you do see, or when you see a village, it's normally nothing more than maybe a couple of dozen, even fewer, dilapidated buildings along the side of a road. But inevitably, when you go into almost any one of these villages, you will see a monument to the men, women who died there fighting the fascists, as they like to
Mhm.
say.
Well, let's move on, because we've got loads of photos of bunkers as well, which you
Oh,
wanted to see.
yes.
So let's move. So we're kind of moving into Lithuania now, but for the
Yes.
people who watch the channel, they think of the Atlantic Wall and the German bunkers there, but this, I mean, they look very similar. These are very substantial concrete emplacements.
Yes. And this was right across the border. Now, remember, the 6th Infantry Division was on the very far northern or left flank of Army Group Center. It was initially attached for the first day of the war, maybe the second day. I think it was attached to Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group, and then it went back to Adolf Strauss's 9th Army. But the minute they crossed the border, the 2nd Battalion of the 18th Infantry Regiment of 6th Infantry Division encountered, I don't know how many of these bunkers were there, but there were a fair number. And there were still a half dozen of them there when we visited this area. And of course, you can see all the chinks where they were hit by anti-tank weapons or what have you. And the Russians fought so fanatically on the first and second day of the war that the 2nd Battalion had to call up combat engineers with flamethrowers to burn them out of these bunkers. just a harbinger of what was to come in the combat that followed, because too many times, and certainly with sources going back decades, people were left with the impression that, oh well, Hitler just kind of rolled through Russia, rolled through to be accurate, I should say, Soviet Russia. The way he had rolled through Poland in September of 1939, like a knife through butter. And then after a few months, just on the outskirts of Moscow, the rains of the Rasputitsa, what the Russians call the Rasputitsa, the time without roads, the rains came, and then the snow, and the German advance came to an abrupt halt, and the Russians were saved. No, sir. The fighting was vicious. The attrition that the Russians caused, the German Ostehr, the German Eastern armies, from the very first day of the campaign was very serious and very significant.
We had a question from Stephen about when those bunkers were built. I mean, for what period are they from?
Oh, great question. Great question. This is just an example of how unprepared the Russians were in June of 41 when the Germans attacked. Remember, on the 23rd of August, Molotov and Ribbentrop, the two foreign ministers, had signed that non-aggression pact between Germany and Soviet Russia that shook the world, shook its foundations. And one of the secret protocols was that the Germans would invade, on the 1st of September, and the Russians would invade the eastern part of Poland a couple of weeks later. So the Russians invaded on the 17th of September, and they met in the area around Brest-Litovsk. In fact, Guderian's 19th Motorized Corps actually captured Brest-Litovsk, okay? Then he had to give it back to the Russians because it was beyond the demarcation line that they'd established. And so the Germans had to assault that fortress on the 22nd of June, and the 45th Infantry Division that assaulted it, mostly Austrian unit, they suffered 311 KIA, if you can believe that, including 20 officers. But getting back to these bunkers, so the Russians had advanced their western frontier 200 kilometers to the west. So they said, okay, we need to build up a defensive line here too. So what they started to do was to dismantle the Stalin line along the 1939 Russian-Polish frontier, okay, and along their 1939 frontier. They started to dismantle part of it and move it up to their new border, a couple hundred kilometers to the west. And the end result of that was that they ended up with a new Molotov line right on the new demarcation line with Germany that wasn't anywhere near complete, but at the same time, they had torn down a good portion of what had been complete, or pretty much complete, their Stalin line along the frontier. So when the Germans came upon it, and Haape's division, the 6th ID, attacked it on the town of Polotsk on the 15th of June, they just broke right through. And they were surprised because some of the Soviet bunkers there, and we have pictures of them, were hardly even defended at all.
Our next photo, I don't want to dwell too long on it because I want to go back to the terrain, but if you're traveling through that area there, obviously you're seeing sites of just battlefields. So where the the Red Army fought the Germans, but you can't help but, of course, come across aspects related to the Holocaust, the Einsatzgruppe and all that kind of stuff there. If you're traveling with German veterans in your first trip, or sons of German veterans, How did you deal with that when you say you're seeing victory monuments about the Soviet defeat of the Germans, but then you're seeing things like this, which was a synagogue where the Jews were mostly taken about and killed. How did you deal with those types of locations?
Yeah, this was, I would have to look at my map here, but Osmiana, they reached elements of the 6th Infantry, I think Haape's regiment, the 18th Infantry, reached it on or about the 4th of July. And shown here on this map, but that's not really, that doesn't matter. I'll just let that go. But I was not with a group of veterans here. I was just with Johannes Haape and our Russian guide. But there was a very excellent Russian museum here and a very nice young lady who we could speak German with, who took us out and showed us things, let us look at documents that they had. And then of course there's this great Jewish site. I know what it is, I just can't think of it right now, that you can go to. You plug in anything, any town in the area, in European Russia, Poland, Romania, what have you, and you'll find out what happened there. And the Jews, there were several thousand Jews in Osmiana, and the Germans began to round them up right from the start, but literally they did it for some reason in several phases. So the final Jews were not removed from Osmiana until I think sometime in 1943, and whether they were sent to Auschwitz or Birkenau or Modnek, I'm not sure, but they were all killed, and this building, this synagogue, has not been used as a synagogue since. It's just a mute testimony to what happened to the Jewish people as the Germans, the Einsatzgruppen, the murder squads went in and started killing them in cooperation, unfortunately, with a number of German Wehrmacht units, and also with local indigenous militias, who also, that's another thing that people might not be aware of. Once the Germans invaded in Lithuania, in Western Ukraine, these militia groups just went into action and started initiating their own pogroms against the Jewish people. So I mean, the war just unleashed these kind of hatreds that exist in Eastern Europe that would be completely foreign to us. Niall Ferguson wrote a book a few years ago called The War of the Worlds or something, about warfare in the 20th century. And he talked about how after the Germans invaded, there were some families who lived in that in-between land that had changed hands so many times between Poland and Lithuania and Ukraine, where a Polish man was married to a Ukrainian woman, and sometimes one murdered the other.
Yeah.
It's just, as a Westerner, Paul, I just think it's really almost impossible for us to get our brain around it.
I mean, and that's even my limited experience on not even the Eastern Front, but the Central Front, as I said, in Slovakia, Hungary, it's so different from the fighting in Normandy. The boundaries of good guys and bad guys and the atrocities just pile up. The atrocities and murder and terror is a daily occurrence there, whereas in Normandy, mercifully, it was a fairly rare thing, and most combat was, to some extent, civilized. I'm using that word, with some reservation, but people will know what I mean. Whereas out here, it's unrelenting. But I'm conscious of the fact we need to move through these slides. So let's get to this, the way the Soviets, or the Russians in this case, preserve these battlefields? Because as I said, there's another T-34 again. And
Yes,
then you
I
have
think,
these positions, the Stalin line. So tell us about visiting the museums and the Stalin line.
yeah. Well, this is kind of an interesting museum, kind of an open air museum, and there are other pictures there which kind of show you how. Yeah, there's one of the Stalin organs, which first went into action, I believe, on the Central Front in I can't remember the exact day. I think it was sometime around mid-July against a German Panzer division, and it was a totally secret weapon, of course, and even the Russian troops, the Red Army troops at the front, didn't know about it, and they fled too. When the Russians started launching these weapons, the Russian soldiers fled back from the front because they were equally terrified. But it's interesting though, because oh damn, what was the caliber? It was like 132 caliber. They later came up with much heavier caliber weapons. This was the BM-13 version, and they often mounted them on Ford trucks. And they could fire. They had a horrible scream, of course, when they came down, and a splinter effect. But unless they hit, and now I'm talking about the 1941 version now, unless they hit a tank or an armored fighting vehicle directly, they weren't going to destroy it. What they could do is, if you were in a trench and you tried to just hunker down in that trench, these things could throw up so much dirt around you, they would bury you alive. But I had when I corresponded with a group of German veterans, dozens of them, for my book Barbarossa Unleashed, one of the things I asked on my questionnaire was, tell me about Soviet weapons. What Soviet weapon were you most afraid of? And it was not this weapon, because they learned very quickly that it was inaccurate, that its splitter effect was not as great as it could have been. Sometimes the shells just like broke into a couple of parts. And if they stood up in their trench, and if that way, if some of these hit around them, covered them with dirt, they could dig their way out much more easily than if they were, supine or cowering down in a position. But they didn't find this weapon in many respects to be, well, certainly not the one that they most feared. But then later on, I think that changed, because the Russians started to use them in an order of magnitude larger numbers, and you have hundreds of those things raining down on you. That is a different story.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks. So we'll carry on going through the museums here. Yeah, there are T-34s and Russian armor of various eras there. And that's,
here
I think that emphasizes the flatness of the terrain as well.
Here you can see how flat the so much of the terrain was. And and a lot of that was fairly good tank country, I would say, particularly in Ukraine. And here we get into Minsk. Minsk was, and it's just so ugly, these Soviet era structures, these massive buildings. But now it's a city. Oh, got to stop there. Now Minsk is a city of about 2 million. In June of 1941, it was a city of about 300,000. And it was bombed mercilessly by the Germans at the start of the war. And unfortunately, they had a freie Jagd, I guess you'd call it, just freak pickings, and Russian refugees with their carts, their animals, their children trying to flee. They would often be strafed the BF-109s and so forth. And so a lot of civilians were killed. This is what we drove through. This is a major highway in Belarus, okay? And you can see, I mean, it certainly didn't look much different than this in June or July of 1941. You can see how dense and thick those forests are. And the Germans went into Russia. This is one thing very interesting, Paul. They did not know squat about forest fighting. They did not know squat. They hadn't practiced it. You talk about progressive environmental laws. The Wehrmacht couldn't get near German forests, okay, because they were so protected. So they couldn't have training grounds in the forests. And then in Western Europe, there weren't other forests, France or other areas that they could find, which were large enough to really train for forest fighting. So they had to learn the hard way. And in several instances, and I lay out several kind of case studies in my book, Barbarossa Unleashed, where the Germans initially just got their butts kicked fighting with the Russians. I mean, the Russians wouldn't just stand, if they came out to try to ambush, they could come out of the forest, but they would set up their positions deeper inside the forest, and they were masters, absolute masters of camouflage. And so the Germans would just get ambushed going in to into those areas. So that was one thing that they had to learn the hard way, and they suffered a lot of casualties. And then even as you got closer to Moscow, like around Bryansk, that area just covered with forests. And of course, that facilitated the rise of the partisan movement.
Yeah.
Because they could hide, tens of thousands could hide in these forests, and then the Germans would have to go in with these special initiatives, and sometimes they'd have to take troops that they desperately needed at the front, because the Germans, from the beginning to end, were perennially short of infantry. They'd have to pull units off the front line to go fight these battles against these partisans.
Well, we had the question because you said about the rockets weren't the number one thing the Germans were scared of. So Terry so what weapon in your questionnaire to the veterans, what was the one they were the most afraid of in the 41 period?
You would be surprised at the diversity of answers that I got. I don't have it up on my screen right now, but a lot of them said very different things. I don't recall that there was like a theme. Some might talk about the T-34, and of course, some of the initial encounters with the T-34 were came as really as an adrenal shock for the Germans when their little 37 millimeter or even 50 millimeter pea shooter anti-tank guns couldn't do any damage, and then they just got steamrolled by the Russians. But there was the PPSH-41. The Russians had a submachine gun, which was an incredible weapon. It was just stamped, put together really simply. They manufactured huge numbers of them, and I don't know how much of them they came up against in the opening weeks, but I know that I've read many German memoirs and letters and so forth where they talk about how good these weapons were and how they would just, toss away their German weapon and use the PPSH-41. Another weapon was what they called was a 76 millimeter. I think it was kind of an all-purpose gun. The Germans, the Rochboom. They called it that because the muzzle velocity was so fast, you would hear the shell explode before you heard the sound of it leaving the muzzle. So those are just a few, and in general, I might say the Soviet artillery, which of course
Yeah.
became so much more of a problem later in the war. The Soviet artillery, going back to the Tsarist era, the Tsarist, the Russians have always been known for being excellent engineers and having excellent artillery. And the Russians certainly did. They had artillery that outranged the Germans. And I have one description, I think it comes from later in the war, 43 or 44, where German, it was from a doctor, of a book by a German doctor, a different one, where he describes in the most graphic detail the unit he was with getting hit by a sudden barrage of artillery. It's one of the most graphic descriptions, Paul, you will ever read of what warfare is at its worst, of human beings literally getting blown apart. And I had actually, my undergraduate college has a alumni magazine, and they did a nice piece with even a cover piece on that book when it came out in 2014, but they wanted me to send them an excerpt. So I sent them that.
Wow.
And they said, Craig, yeah, wow, we get the point, but now this would be going out to alumni from my college, right? They said, we just can't do it. We can't send that out. It's going to run somebody's going to throw up their lunch if we send that out for them to read.
Wow. Well, brilliant stuff. We'll keep on plowing through the photos, otherwise we'll be here. So this is one of the bunkers where you're taking Dr. Haape's son to a specific place where there's a specific memorable battle. So briefly tell us about this one.
Yeah, this is where they broke through the Stalin line along the Western Dvina River, just at a little town just outside of Polotsk. And these were some of the bunkers that were, this was on a little hill. But look at that. This is not something, all the flower arrangements and everything, you see that everywhere. They just have held on to these memories 80 years after the war. And look at the casualties that the Russians have suffered in this war in Ukraine. They probably suffered over 1 million casualties. We Westerners would never have the intestinal fortitude to fight a war like that ever again. I suppose that's a whole other story, but I don't have really the details at my fingertips, other than that the 6th Infantry broke through the Stalin line here fairly easily. I think there were several other divisions involved in the fight area, and they got across the Western Dvina and the Stalin line on the again on the 15th of July. The Russians had what they call fortified regions. They had dozens of these so-called fortified regions. They had them along the frontier where the Germans attacked on the 22nd of June, particularly in the sector Army Group South. They had some areas that had been very heavily fortified with bunkers and barbed wire and all kinds of devious booby traps and obstacles. And in my new book, Guderian's Panzers, that is just coming out, I have a description from a soldier who was a Panzerjäger, an anti-tanker in the 299th Infantry Division, I think with 6th Army. But this was when Guderian had made his push south into the Ukraine, which culminated in the encirclement of like 5 or 6 Soviet armies and the destruction of like 50 Soviet divisions. This Panzerjäger Roth, he describes in granular detail the nature of the defenses the Soviets had in front of Kiev. And I mean, electrified wire, flamethrowers that would just go off automatically. I mean, the most devious things you have ever heard of in your life. And if you get that book, it'll just blow you away when you read about what the Germans had to deal with in that sector when they advanced on Kiev, which they literally reached the outskirts of Kiev sometime in mid, or I think not much later than the 20th of July, but they didn't capture the city until like the 19th of September, 2 months later, because the attack in that area just came to a halt for 2 months.
So tell us about that photo there and the next one are what I think of as being typical of the terrain in that kind of. That's how the Russians or Soviet movies I've got from sort of the 80s and 90s have that sort of terrain. That again, it's that kind of low, sort of tall grass and sort of undergrowth. But you're also saying that despite the kind of the bleakness of the forest, it was quite beautiful as well.
Oh, it was. Oh my, that's got to stay on that one for a minute. Yes, Russia had its tremendous natural beauty, and it's something that Dr. Haape was. He wasn't only a doctor, he wasn't only a brave soldier, a man of unimpeachable integrity. He was also a nature lover and a brilliant writer. And he appreciated these things and would write about them from time to time. But yeah, and there are many descriptions from the winter when you have this everything's covered with snow. You have this monochromatic terrain, right? But then the trees, and you have the snow hanging from the trees, and the stars, and a number of accounts in the memoirs and published and unpublished in the diaries. The German soldiers at times are just in awe of the physical, just the raw physical beauty of nature in a way that they probably hadn't seen it in their own in Germany. Now this was the Mesa River line. And as I point out, it's due north of Smolensk. This is where the advance of the 6th Infantry Division and Haape's 18th Infantry, this is where it came to a screeching halt on the 30th of July, 1941, when Hitler issued his, I think it was Directive Number 34, and he put Army Group Center on the defensive. He did that for a couple of reasons. One, the Panzer divisions, the mechanized divisions, needed to be pulled out and refurbished before they could continue to advance. That was one of the reasons. The other reason is that the Russians, ever since early July, actually, had been remorselessly counterattacking across the entire sector of Bach's Army Group Center. And by this point, Paul, his front, or he had an eastern front, and then it was kind of enfiladed, or no, what's the word? Reverse. It's kind of pulled back. I can't think of the technical word, but it's kind of pulled back to the to the southwest and kind of facing toward the south. And that's where Guderian's forces were, and where he began his advance that I mentioned earlier down toward Kiev. But refused. His right flank was refused. But his eastern front, heading toward Moscow, was like at least 500 kilometers in length. Um, and it was brought to a complete halt, and it was under constant attack by the Soviets, one offensive after another. And one of these was what I think they called the Timoshenko offensive that began around the 23rd of June, went into July, and actually the Russian attacks did not stop until the 7th of September, or the 8th of September, the beginning of the second week of September, 1941, and that's finally when the Russians had been so badly attrited. Because keep in mind, I've talked a lot about the German attrition. The Germans almost always had what they called a positive, no matter the situation, a positive casualty exchange rate from the beginning to the end of the war on the Eastern Front. In other words, they inflicted more casualties than they incurred themselves. The problem was Germany was a country of 80 million. The USSR was a country of 190 million. And the Germans just couldn't replace their losses nearly as easy as the Russian could. But in this godforsaken area here, Haape's division spent, they dug in, like World War I. They built regular trench lines and bunkers. And he writes to his wife about that. He was very open with his wife about everything. He didn't, like a lot of the soldiers, when they wrote home, Paul, as you know, they would sugarcoat it. Okay. He didn't. Like even on the letter he sent back on the first day of the war, describing what happened on the 22nd of June, I think he pointed out that our regiment suffered more casualties than it incurred during the entire weeks of combat in France in 1940. And so his unit was stuck in that area for the better part of 2 months until, and that's another Soviet war memorial by Dukovshina, which is it's pretty close to Smolensk.
And you can just see the number of names on
Yeah.
there. I mean, that it's the scale that always blows my mind there. I can drive a few minutes down the road and go to a cemetery of 30 or 40 British graves, or maybe a couple of hundred, and a few. Obviously, there's tens of thousands of Germans here, but there, everything is thousands and thousands. That when we move on through this, was it 30,000 German graves there from one battle?
And that's in Dukovshina, where they've been burying. Oh, they're still finding. We're given a tour by somebody who works at the German War Graves Commission in Smolensk, because this isn't too far from Smolensk. And he's just pointing, oh, we know there are more German graves over here, and we know there are more over here, and we know there are more over here. This is the largest German cemetery, I think, in Europe, all of Europe, that is managed by the German War Graves Commission. And when we were there in 2016, Paul, this big giant map up on the wall, color map, showing up, we found 50,000 bodies here, 25,000 here, and where they're interred now. They, at that point, had only discovered something like 300,000 of the German soldiers that had been buried within the borders of Soviet Russia between 1941 and 1944. And by the time the Germans had been pushed out and beyond those Russian borders, there were 4 million German KIA. So they, at that point, they had discovered less than 10%.
Wow. I mean, there's the Dnieper River there, and but it's this terrain that we're back that same kind of thick grass and and again this is we're to Operation Typhoon right now. But again, no big mountains in the background, basically pretty damn flat.
With pretty damn flat, with woods. I mean, sometimes major woods, lots of times just little clumps of trees. These villages that look, as I showed you, that just straggle along a dirt road back in those days. And of course, I think something like 50, 60,000 of them were destroyed over the course of the war. And you'll still have you'll come to a little village of Shitinkovo, I think, where we actually met an elderly woman who had been there at the end of December 1941, when elements of the 6th Infantry Division were under attack and being pulled back during the running for their lives, really, during the Soviet counteroffensive. And there's still a little village there, and people living there. That's it. Go back. Can you go back one, Paul? Yeah, that's the village of Shitinkovo. There might have been a few more. Maybe I'm not saying it right, but tenacious combat, as I pointed out. And it was also here that a really, really tragic thing happened. Oberleutnant Graf von Kageneck, famous German family. One of the Kagenecks was in a Panzer division. One, I think, was a flyer, Bf 109 Ace, who fought in North Africa, and I think was killed in January of 42. Graf von Kageneck was killed here on the 29th. He was, I believe, the commander of the 12th Company, a German infantry regiment at that time. A German infantry division had 3 regiments, okay? Each regiment had 3 battalions of 4 companies. And then there were like 3 independent companies, like a reconnaissance and anti-tank unit and so forth, that were organic to the regiment, but belonged to the regimental commander. Well, the 12th, the 4th company in a regiment, the 4th, 8th, and 12th, was always the heavy company with the heavy machine guns, the 81 millimeter mortars, and so forth. And I think that Kageneck was commander of the 12th company in Haape's 3rd battalion, which had the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th companies. Well, he suffered a minor head wound, okay? The ground is covered with snow. It's, I don't know, 30 below, 20 below, whatever it is. So Haape, they were very close. Dr. Haape patches him up with a white gauze and bandage. The problem was, when he went out to fight again, that bandage stuck out like a sore thumb. And so he got hit by probably a Soviet sniper. Soviet snipers took out so many German soldiers that would have been a really scary thing. In 1943, the Germans did a study, and they found out that roughly 43% of their KIA in Russia were men who had been hit in the head. Now, that doesn't all mean by snipers, but you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
So anyway, Kaga went out, and Haape didn't know about this until he's pulling back, and someone comes with a wagon up, pulling one of these little panya wagons with the the Russian Eastern European Panya horses, these small, rugged little horses, they couldn't pull a big artillery piece, but the Germans loved them because they could get by with eating or drinking almost nothing, and they were unbelievably hardier than the bigger Western European mounts. So this little Panya wagon is coming along with a couple men, and Haape sees that there's a wounded soldier inside. So he goes and looks, and to his horror, he sees it's Oberleutnant Kageneck, who's been hit in the head again. And Haape does whatever he can to try and save him, but he can't do it. And to make it worse, Kageneck was married to the Princess of Bavaria, and she had just given him twin boys 3 weeks before.
Wow. Well, people are loving these anecdotes. We ought to go back and see some of these photos. Otherwise, we'll be here till next Thursday or something. Not that we're loving it. Don't worry. I'm just saying. Let's move on through some of these things here. And the next one is of some of these ceremonies, because you said you were there in was it the 75th you were there for, wasn't it? 75th, yeah.
Yes, the 75th when we were in Rzhev on the 22nd of June, 2016, and the thing before that was a procession through Vyazma. That's one of the cities, large towns that was encircled by the Germans during Operation Typhoon, the advance toward Moscow, where there were very large encirclement at Vyazma, and then a smaller one at Bryansk. And here they are, literally celebrating the 777th anniversary of the town. And so it was just purely coincidental that we happened to stumble upon that. But it was quite a fascinating little event.
And again, these little independent collective farms going surrounded by just completely nothing. It's amazing, amazing terrain.
Yeah, that's just so typical, and it's still very. I mean, you go into parts of Moscow, like the Gum department store and Red Square. I mean, it's blows your mind. It's unbelievable. But you get out into the country, and it's a third world country primarily, and I didn't know, but Sergei, our guide, told us that it means the Dnieper River. Our guide told us that some of those kolchoza, those collective farms, are still active.
Yeah. And cemeteries, as we've been saying, everywhere are cemeteries and memorials. And I think people are generally surprised that there are German cemeteries, because we're not in Russia proper here. We're outside in what was the Soviet Union. So they exist. And but yeah, amazing photo. It's a fantastic travelogue. And always the contrast between these abandoned old collective farms and these, as I said at the beginning, these very grand, spacious monuments. You can tell them, and then you have the roads. And that's my favorite of your photos, Craig.
Yeah, that's and these were sectors through which Haape's 6th Infantry Division went, and in many areas, it just hasn't changed much. I saw photos from just, I think, 10 years ago of a major highway leading into Moscow, which had been in the Rasputitsa period, the time of the heavy rains, which comes in the fall, and then like in March and April. Here you go, seeing some of it. And the roads, Paul, from, I don't know, 2015, looked exactly like this.
Yeah.
They didn't look any different.
Yeah. Another abandoned farm.
Yeah.
And I think the reason we have you here is that people, when they're reading either your books or Prit Buttar's book or David Stahl's books, they're going to have a lot more of a visual idea of some of this area now, because it's very hard when you're reading a big dense book, or one of the other classics. I'm thinking of David Glanz's books, for example. There are very few photos in some of David's books, but this is giving us that insight. It's like explaining to someone what the Normandy Bocage is like, or what a rocky hillside in Tunisia looks like. You need to see these places, and this presentation is really giving us an example of that. So the rivers, though, we haven't talked much about the rivers, because you obviously got the big wide ones and we think of the Volga, but this next photo here, I think, tell us about how both the Germans and the Red Army dealt these kind of rivers, because we have Bailey bridges, British and American armies.
Right. Yeah, I've read. I'd never even known about them, but I read about their use in Korea in the early 50s. Well, there were, I mentioned some of the main rivers, and that they flow north to south, but there are little streams and things, as you would imagine, everywhere. I remember reading about Hoths on the northern or western flank of Army Group North, where Haape's 6th Infantry was, with the 7th Panzer Division, Funk's, I think it was commanded by General Funk, his 7th Panzer Division, trying to just get through the terrain. And there were literally dozens of these little rivers that they had to get across, and they either had to bring up engineers. Sometimes they could find a ford. Now, I don't know how deep this is. Maybe this one could be forded by a tank or a truck. Probably not, but maybe. And now this is north of Rzhev, and I think to the west, Kalinin, and this was the farthest point reached by Haape's 18th Infantry Regiment and his 6th Infantry Division. Again, here in late October, and then they were just getting ready for the winter.
Wow,
digging in and getting ready for what was coming.
Yeah, we'll keep on going. So memorials again. Every village has got
everywhere. It's really kind of amazing thing. And as a Westerner, living in a postmodern world where very few people honor the sacrifices that our servicemen, and in some cases our service women, have made, it's bittersweet to me when I see things like this, Paul, because we don't do this.
Yeah. Living in Normandy, we do it here. So yeah, I mean, normally, I'm with you. Around the world, yeah, I agree. And another one of these just flat grass, little village that's all single story. There's nothing of any height or substance. I mean, I think of some battlefield, there's always like a church with a spire, or there's some kind of central town hall. These are very rustic, rural. I mean, modest. I mean, are the words.
Occasionally, you'll see a town like this with a very beautiful Russian church by it. Not often, but I have one picture in one of my books where I show that. But imagine living in something like that when it's 30 or 40 below. I mean, in each of these places, life would take place around this large oven, which they would cook their food, and then they would just stoke it with wood to keep it warm and get some warmth. And they would put up over the windows, they would just like cover it with paper or something like that to keep the cold out. And in many cases, their farm animals would be let in to live with them, or would be in an area right next to them, and to go to the bathroom 40 below, and you got to go out into an outhouse.
Yeah,
I mean,
very, very,
there were
very different type of life, and this is again, I mean, this is again
oh,
probably
yes.
that's probably a main road. Then this, you're literally trying to find places because again, if people are traveling to Normandy or the Market Garden battlefields, they've got incredibly well printed maps, they've got GPS, they've got Google Earth, they've got all their they've got signage, information about it. You're in at this point here, you're kind of in the arse end of nowhere, aren't you?
Yes, as our guide, as Sergei once said to us when we reached a point like this, he said, "Ja, wir sind endlich am Arsch der Welt." We're finally on the ass of the world.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I
But
mean, and you can see again, you can see the roads, and you can see how dense it gets off the road again, there,
yeah,
and that again, that kind of, I mean, that kind of cows pasting as we call it in England, and then that just bracken and ferns
yes, yeah,
and below the trees at the back, it's just pitch black. It's a real insight into what that terrain is like,
yeah,
and then the rivers again, yeah,
yeah. And this is, let me see, this is near, yeah, Olatino. You're right. Okay, this is where the Sixth ID actually crossed the Volga on its way up to that other little river we just saw, where it reached the final point of its advance. And
yeah,
Staritsa is a beautiful little village with an incredible church, and they were in the process of rebuilding it when we were there, and they were playing the bells were ringing, and I think it was 3 o'clock back home, but I had to call my wife and wake her up and say, "Honey, listen to these bells here in Staritsa, Russia." But it was that was amazing.
yeah. No, we'll keep on playing through these photos, and
Yeah, I mean, look at how gorgeous that is.
it's that you often see that with what I would call the kind of not so much the third world, but the less developed countries, is that they would have this contrast between they tend to love their religion, so big old churches, big old things, and I say the memorials have been huge, and then the actual living accommodations, either as you said in the cities, these horrible kind of communist era blocks, or these
Right.
very very primitive farms. It's truly enlightening, this stuff. So we'll keep on going. So where are we going to get to next? Riverbanks
Yeah,
and more.
that's outside. That's the old church there, just on the Volga, just by Staritsa.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the monastery, isn't it? Yeah, fantastic
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah, yeah, really fantastic picture. And this is really interesting. I don't know what that remain is, but according to some information that we got along the way, um, there is a mass grave here of almost 40 German soldiers, and we debated getting in touch with the German War Graves Commission, and I'm going to have to ask Johannes. Johannes, Haape, the son of Dr. Haape, and we were all together on this trip, and he's a very successful tour agency in Germany called Taruk, Taruk, and he is. I sent him this as well, so he may be watching this right now. But he is in, I think, Namibia at this point, and they're building another lodge. And so he's very interested in what we're doing. But yeah, we heard that there are, but they're just everywhere. And I don't know if this is apocryphal or if it's true. I think it certainly could be true. One of the German soldiers told us that when Russians, because they're so poor, so many of them, that's why I nearly got beaten to death. I think they're just looking for whatever they can steal from you. Some of them, the scavengers, have taken the skulls of German soldiers and they've turned them into lamps and sell
Wow.
them on the black market.
Wow. I say it's a very different battlefield. And again, you were there in 2016 for the 70th anniversary of the invasion, and seeing people of different ages commemorating that is and how different they maybe commemorate it there than perhaps they
Yeah.
commemorate events in the UK or France or what have you.
And all these young people. And when I was there in 2005 with the Kuratorium, and we went to visit some of the schools, like you know, with like young kids, I remember we went in and they were all drawing pictures of the war. They're, you know, airplanes and tanks and this and that. Yeah, they work diligently to keep those memories alive.
Yeah. And that one's great with the ceremony occurring by the river itself. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we'll keep on going.
Oh my God. And this is where I got nearly beaten to
That's
death.
where you got you got your ass handed to you on a plate, as we say in English. But we're glad you're
Yes.
still with us. We're glad you
hotel-
made it through this.
Thank you, though. The hotel is just to the left of those trees, but that's not very thick there. I think it was a little closer where you can see kind of the ghost-like image of the person in front. It's a little farther back where it was like a wall, okay? You couldn't see anything behind it. And that's where the people, 2 or 3 of them, that's where they were hiding. One guy came out, grabbed my right shoulder because I had bruises, okay? Grabbed my right shoulder, threw me around, punched me in the left eye, the right eye, and I don't remember anything else.
Wow. I mean that's dedication to visiting battlefields, that you'll take a beating to get there, and this is you with Johannes there, which is a great photo of the kind of the bonding that can happen on these trips, because you know in between the study of the battlefields, you know you're spending time getting lost together, discovering places his father was. You can see there it was a very important, meaningful trip.
It was. He's a wonderful guy. I love him dearly, and his family, and he has been so helpful to me. He provided me essentially with his father's all his father's papers and so forth, photos, and I was able to use those for several of my books. And then, of course, in the Moscow tram stop in Dr. Haape's memoir, one of the appendices, Paul, is 3 dozen of the letters he wrote during that same 9-month time period he covers from like June 41 to April of 42. 36 letters that he wrote. Like the first one he wrote the very evening of he's writing about it as it's happening. You can read those letters and then compare them to the text that he composed 15 years later.
Wow. And we've just got a few more photos to go, because we'll leave off the Moscow bit, because we can do that another time. Again, rivers, that sort of strange undergrowth that we're getting used to now in this thing there, and the forests and
that was captivating photo. I love that. Yeah, modest attempt at an artistic photograph. Yeah, the Kalinin is called Tver now, Tver, but that was a beautiful monument, and brings back a lot of memories.
And you can see the incredible width of the Volga River there, because like the Rhine further west, it's not just a river. I mean, as we had Dr. John Kuratorium on a few weeks ago, well, months ago now, talking about the crossing of the Rhine by the U.S. Army is essentially being an amphibious landing in the sense of Overlord or Salerno, because when you get to a river that size, you've got to get an army across. It's a massive thing, and so we'll have much more insight into this terrain when we carry on reading your books. And I think we'll end with this photo there, because there you are. So explain who's this. There's you.
This is a very good photo to end with. Yeah, there's Johannes. You can see sitting on the left. I'm standing up there, probably a little thinner than I am now, but then the gentleman on the right, Dietrich Schöning, wonderful man, tall, elegant, beautifully spoken. He was, this was in 2016, Paul. He was 98, as it says there. He was the only German veteran with the Kuratorium. We weren't with the Kuratorium officially this time, but we met up with them there. But he was the only veteran who traveled from Germany with the Kuratorium Rzhev. When I was there in 2005, he led the German group. He spoke to all the Russian soldiers and the mayor and everyone very eloquently. By this point, he was too sick to do any of that. And he literally passed away 3 or 4 weeks after this.
Wow. Wow.
And if you remember, during Operation Bagration in June of 44, when they just tore Army Group Center to pieces, he was one of the men who was captured. He was an artillery soldier. You ever seen that picture from July 44 when they're marching 50,000 German soldiers,
Yep.
parading them through Moscow? He was there. He was in that.
Wow. Wow. Well, Nick watching has summed up how people have felt about this. Great presentation, and really appreciate your time and information. Well done. I think it's the insight into just the area, the people, the terrain, the countryside. So Craig, you're coming back in a few weeks' time to talk about your latest book on Guderian, which will be sort of more of a traditional World War II TV presentation, a bit more operational history there. But this one has been a fantastic insight to experiences there. And not many tour guides I know have nearly been beaten to death on a battlefield exploration.
Well, we said, we laughed about it, and with the jury said I was the final victim of the Partisanenkrieg. The party.
Yeah. We did have a question. Were the people who beat you up caught? Did they know who did it?
No. The next day, my brain is I'm still, half out of it. The next day, a very nice young man from the local police came out and interviewed me and the other guy who was beaten up with. Fortunately, he was not one of the veterans. He probably wouldn't have survived. He's a little younger and a former wrestler. So I figured we were safe walking back together. We were interviewed. We explained what happened. We left the next day, and I'm sure everything he wrote just probably was dropped right into file 13, as we say, the trash
It's
can.
probably in a massive, great list of unsolved cases of foreigners being beaten up. Yeah. So, well, we'll end things there, folks. Just a reminder what we've got coming up tomorrow. Phil Watson is joining us to talk about the defense of the 12th Lancers near Dunkirk in 1940. We've got trips to Saipan this week. We're doing Guadalcanal with Dave Holland. We've got all sorts of stuff coming your way. Click like and subscribe. Buy my guests' books. Become a patron of World War II TV. I said the links to Craig's website is in the description below, where you can carry on reading about his travels and his blogs and what have you, and say the links to the books there. But we'll see you in a few weeks' time, Craig. It's been fantastic talking to you. I'll let you get back to the cat.
Really enjoyed it.
It's been brilliant. We've really enjoyed it. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.
Thank you, Paul. Bye. Thanks, guys.